Thanks for staying with us. Chuck Muether here for the final segment of today's Little Manse on the Prairie program. This is a season when the Reformed Church celebrates the Reformation, and this year the celebration has been a bit more celebratory as many commemorate the anniversary of Martin Luther's nailing of the 95 Theses on the castle door of Wittenberg, Germany. So I'm here with my good friend, the Reverend J. Fluck, a minister in the Reformed Church in the United States, and who also teaches church history at Heidelberg Theological Seminary in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I actually called him up an hour before this because I was so excited to visit with him. I think he was still in his PJs. Welcome, Pastor and Professor Fluck.
You're assuming I'm not in my PJs anymore.
So you're going to run down your top 10 moments in Reformation history, and we begin with number 10 until we hit number 1.
So let's begin with number 10. And just because it's number 10 doesn't mean it's not important. There are a whole lot of important things. These are just the top 10. Number 10 on that list is Martin Luther's match, the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door. But that was done on October 31st. But October 31st was the witches' Sabbath, and that was when all the bad things came out at night, the witches and the demons and everything else. And so the Roman Church, in its syncretism, had decided that the only way they could deal with that in German mythology was that if the dawn came on the 1st of November, that they could say that the good things, the saints, had vanquished the evil. And so November 1st became All Saints' Day, and it became a holiday, a festival day. And that was the day when they had entertainment. But since they hadn't invented computers yet, the entertainment was, well, you had bards, you had some demonstrations in juggling and things, but you also had debates between the theologians in town, because the theologians could get kind of funny in how they related to each other and how they got angry. And so Martin Luther had nailed the theses up so that they would have this opportunity to begin to have the debate on the next day. That debate was the spark that lit a match, lit a bonfire that had been being built for 50 years or more. But that bonfire was sparked by Martin Luther. And that's why this date is the 10th important, because it sparked what we call the Reformation. It's the result of many other things, but it sparked the Reformation. Number 9 on our list would be 1521. 1521 was when Martin Luther was taken to the Diet of Worms. There he was challenged. He had been, for 4 years, arguing with the Pope about the Pope's ability not only to forgive sins, but to do so by indulgences. And he was saying now that salvation wasn't by the church, but by grace. And that was why he was taken to Worms, to be tested, to be censured, if you will. And in the course of that debate, they told him that he was a Hussite. He didn't know he was a Hussite, because Huss's works had been on the index. And so he read the Huss's work that was there, and he came back and he said, yes, I am. And he said, here I stand, I can stand nowhere else. When he finished that, before the Synod had a chance to do what it was going to do with him, he went outside, and he was accosted by 6 or 8 men in black with hoods over their heads. They grabbed him, threw him into a carriage, pulled the curtains on the carriage, and drove off. And everybody thought he had been kidnapped and he was going to be done with what had been done with John Huss. But the person who kidnapped him was actually his lord, Frederick of Wartburg. And so Frederick the Wise, that was his title, Frederick the Wise had kidnapped him to take him out of sight so that Frederick could continue to use him politically, and so that Luther could continue to challenge the Pope, which is what Frederick had in mind. In number 8 on our list, sometime in July of 1502, Martin Luther had been going back to school at his father's request, His father was a very diligent man, interested in mining. His father had worked hard and slaved hard and saved hard so that Martin wouldn't have to work so hard. He considered Martin his promising son. And Martin would be able to go to school. So Martin was going to school, and his dad wanted him to study law. Well, the problem with studying law was that Luther really wasn't interested in law, but he was interested in making money. On the way back home, during one break in school, probably in July of 1502, there was a thunderstorm with a lot of lightning. And Martin, who was on foot, took refuge under a tree. Lightning struck the tree. And it knocked Martin out and knocked him down and scared him thoroughly. That made him make a vow while he was still lying there on the ground, probably. That said that if the Lord would allow him to survive this, that he would become a monk. And so Martin was now bound in his own mind by this vow that he had taken. It didn't make his father happy. His father died soon after, and so there was no real fight between him and his father. But Martin became a monk. That was what had started Martin's coming to conversion. That conversion we'll talk about later. If we can move to number 7. Number 7 is Calvin going to Paris. That probably happens in 1531. Calvin goes to Paris to study. He had been a law student, but he had decided he didn't want to be a law student. His parents were not happy about that. But he had discovered that he was interested in the nature of God's work. And so he began to study. He began to study and wound up studying under a man named Jacques Lefebvre. Jacques Lefebvre we'll talk about. He had had other students. Jacques Lefebvre will figure in some of the other things we do. But he began to teach Calvin about the nature of a sovereign God. And under that tutelage, Calvin wrote the first edition of the Institute. That was published in 1536. That was the first time that Calvin was seen by the world. He'd been a student. His teacher knew about him. Some of his fellow students knew about him, like William Farel. But the Institutes were a different sort of thing than what Luther had been doing and saying. They were systematic. The first issue of the Institutes only had 7 chapters, and they were designed to tell the French king, Francis, about what it was that the Reformation was trying to do and what the church was doing wrong. So Calvin now has become an outlaw. However, he's going to want to do something about that being an outlaw. He's going to want to stay an outlaw and leave France. So we've gone from Luther to Calvin. Let's go to number 6. Conversion of Ulrich Zwingli. Ulrich Zwingli is the reformer of the German church in Zurich, Switzerland. He's a monk. He goes to Basel to study in 1509. And while he's in Basel studying in 1509, he becomes a student of a guy named Wittenbach. And he begins then to look at the nature of the church as Wittenbach is teaching him. Wittenbach is not related to Luther at all. He's coming up from a different area in ideas. First of all, he's a different German than German. He's a Swiss German. Zwingli comes to faith sometime either in 1509 or just before when he gets to Basel. By 1512, he has become appointed a pastor in Zurich. And as pastor in Zurich, he begins to do things like doing away with the Mass and taking the church's income and instead of sending it to Rome, using it to feed the poor in Zurich. And he begins to preach the Bible rather than the tradition of the popes. And so Zwingli's conversion then begins to set the foundation for the German version of the Reformed Church. Calvin will do the French. Zwingli will do the German version. And so Zwingli goes to Zurich. Zwingli becomes a little more politically active and as a result becomes chaplain in the army. And he is killed in battle and his death in battle then leaves the Zurich church without a leader. But one of his disciples, a man named Heinrich Bullinger, will take over, and Bullinger will take the German Reformation even further than Zwingli had. Number 5. Luther's conversion comes about when he is in his cell in 1512. His outward career up to 1517 had been virtually nothing. He was deeply religious. He was, at the time of his conversion, sometime near the end of 1512, sitting in his cell in Wittenberg with his Bible open in front of him, and he'd begun to study Paul's letter to Romans. Coming to Romans 1, verse 17, he read, "The just shall live by faith." And he paused, and he pondered, and then joy unspeakable flooded his heart, and the burden of his soul rolled away. That was his conversion. Some people think his conversion happened in 1511 while he was on his knees going up the steps in the Scala Santa in Rome. The Scala Santa was a place where you went to do penance. And your penance was you prayed Paternosters and Hail Marys on each of the steps as you went up on your knees. About halfway up, Luther remembered something he had read in Galatians, that you were saved by grace and not by penance. And so he got up and he went back down the steps. That meant he broke his penance. But that was the start of what bothered him and what led him to the study of Romans and what led him to his conversion about a year later. If we could go to number 4. In 1536, Calvin had finished his first edition of the Institute. According to the legends, Calvin had taken a copy of it after he had it printed, wrote a letter of dedication and a letter of explanation to King Francis of France, and then went down to the palace and lobbed it over the wall. Not exactly a brave way to do this, but he was trying to tell the French king what was wrong with the church and what the church was trying to do in the Reformation. He immediately then left town. He left town on the run. We said he'd become an outlaw. He wanted to go to Strasbourg. But in order to go to Strasbourg, he'd have to go across some really strong French territory. So instead of going the shortest way to Strasbourg, he went down to Switzerland, and he was going to go across that way and avoid as much conflict with the French possible armies and the king as he could. He got to Geneva in the evening, and while he was in the inn that evening, William Farel, who heard he had come to town and who had heard about and perhaps seen the first issue of the Institutes, came down to his room and pleaded with him to stay and serve the church in Geneva. Now, Farel had been a student of Lefebvre's, which is how he had met Calvin. And as that student of Lefebvre, Farel knew what it took to preach, and he was preaching, but he knew he wasn't as well-trained and he wasn't as brilliant as Calvin was. So he wanted Calvin to stay in Geneva. Calvin said no, he didn't want to pastor a church. He really wanted to be a student, and he wanted to go to Strasbourg, and he wanted to study his theology, and he wanted to write his theology. And at that point, at least according to the legends, Farel stood up and Farel thundered at Calvin, "Then may God damn your studies if you desert his church in her hour of need." And that shook Calvin so badly that Calvin stayed in Geneva for 3 years, till the Genevans threw him out. And then 3 years later, after they realized what had happened when they threw him out, how licentious Geneva had become, they asked him to come back when he stayed, and there he stayed for the rest of his life. If I can move to number 3. Zwingli's teacher is Thomas Wittenbach. Thomas Wittenbach went to Basel in 1506. Okay? He had been in Tübingen before, from about 1500. He had taken Zwingli, and having taught Zwingli then, after he had gone to Basel, he had brought to Basel this new concept of biblical study. It was related to humanism. But the relation to humanism was it took the Bible and it wanted to do studies with the Bible rather than studies with what tradition was. Because humanism at that point was interested in studying what the ancients had said, and the Bible was considered ancient. Wittenbach, of course, believed the Bible, but what he had done was he took to Basel the grammatical historical concept. It was then a new concept in studying the Bible because the tradition of the church and the allegorical method of interpretation were the ways you preach the Bible. He had said, no, you preach the Bible by looking at what the words are. And that was what humanism had taught him, the Erasmus humanism, which Luther had picked up. So Thomas Wittenbach is the trainer of the German Reformed Church. Now, the German Reformed Church would take root heavily in Zurich under Zwingli and Bullinger, but it's also in Basel. And since it's there, that becomes the first foothold of the Reformed theology in Switzerland. Then it moves to Zurich, and they work together. They're different than Calvin only in that they speak German and Calvin speaks French. And Switzerland has cantons, states, which speak different languages. So you have a German Reformed Church in Switzerland, and you have a French Reformed Church in Switzerland. And the German Reformed Church's founder is Thomas Wittenbach. If I can move to number 2. The coming of Jacques Lefebvre to Saint-Germain Monastery, Paris, in 1509. He'd been in Paris before as a student, and as early as 1504, he had written a book, a commentary on the Psalms. The commentary on the Psalms, which was so interesting to students that it wound up in student libraries, copied by him. And that commentary wound up in the library of a certain Martin Luther. And Martin Luther used it as he was studying and as he was teaching. And Lefebvre was talking about salvation by grace. He was talking about the sacraments as being means of grace, not grace itself. He was talking about a sovereign God. Zwingli also had a copy of that commentary. And those commentaries were the beginnings of their understanding of what we would call Reformed theology today. Sometime after 1509, he had another student come, a young man named William Farel. Farel would bite into what Lefebvre's teaching, and Lefebvre would be then writing things on Philippians, and would be passing those things on to his students as well. He would be writing on justification. He would be writing on, he critiqued Mary Magdalene, which got him in trouble. And so he was chased out of Paris for a time. But Farel was his student, as well as somebody else named John Calvin. And they, being French, like Lefebvre was French, took his thesis, took his studies, and they went and worked with them. Farel went off after graduation to Geneva, where he began to preach. And while Farel is considered a firebrand, Farel was not the greatest of students. Calvin, on the other hand, is rather famous. And so under Lefebvre, Calvin would begin to write the Institutes, and Lefebvre's theology would be what Calvin would take and pass on to us. And now at last to number 1. Number 1 is January 2nd, 1492. Now that's before Columbus, so please, I'm not confusing this with Columbus and North America and anything about the church coming to the United States. January 2nd, 1492 is what is called the Reconquista. That was an 871-year-long civil war in Spain. And on January 2nd, 1492, the last Moorish stronghold in Spain fell. It fell to the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella. That fall meant that there was no longer an Islamic power in Spain. And Spain could now say, we are a unified country again, which changed the entire balance of power in Europe. It changes all of the politics of Europe, because the Spanish royal family Ferdinand and Isabella, are related by marriage to the French royal family. And whereas before, if the Pope had been having problems with the French, the Spanish were out of the picture because of the Civil War, he could call on the English and the Italians, and they could handle balancing off the French. The German princes didn't matter anything, which is how Huss managed to be executed, to be martyred, because the Pope didn't have to worry about the Germans at all. Now, with the Spanish in the picture, he has to have the German princes to be on his side. And if he doesn't, he can't balance the French and the Spanish, and he will lose control of Europe. So he's going to make allowances for what the Germans want to do. So Strasbourg can have a town and can have a church and can have a theology that will challenge the Pope. So its schools can do that, which is why Calvin wants to go there. The individual electors of Germany can have enough power that they can do things that the Pope doesn't want. And Martin Luther becomes a pawn in that, because Martin Luther represents the one who had challenged the Pope in the worst possible way, in the Pope's opinion. He'd hit him in the pocketbook. And now the German princes were fighting against that. And so all of Europe's theology is challenged. All of Europe's politics is now changed. And that's the bottom line. That's the fuel, the starter, if you will, of that Reformation. It's the accelerant, if you want, in a bonfire. And it's Luther's match on October 31st, 1517, that lights the bonfire.
Well, thank you, Reverend Fluck. Always enjoy your insights. We'll see you this Thursday, same time, same station.